It's easy to predict them. It's hard to be right. I've heard an expert defined as someone who can tell you tomorrow why what he predicted today didn't happen. They have all kinds of reasons for it. I know I've heard about as much about economics here in the last couple of days as in the rest of my life, and it recalls going back to a reunion of my college. I used to regularly attend these reunions, and my old economics professor was there just finishing up grading some papers. And he was going over to the dinner with me, and I noticed that some of these papers looked like they had some familiar questions. In fact, it looked like exactly the same final I had taken a number of years earlier. And I said, aren't you concerned that your students will catch on? He says, it doesn't matter, I keep changing the answers. That didn't really happen, but it could have. Because of my successes in predicting earthquakes since 1974, I've raised a lot of hackles. Because I'm not really a seismologist or a geophysicist, and earthquake prediction is supposed to be the province of these experts. And so far as I know, no one with the Geological Survey has yet predicted a 5 magnitude quake correctly. They've made a number of predictions, at least a dozen, and they have one still hanging fire at Parkfield where they're expecting a 6 magnitude quake by the end of 1992. Their window of time has been 9 years, and it's getting a little tight for them because they were spending tens of millions of dollars a year. And I spend about 100. It costs me, well, I'm not counting plane flights. But I get an almanac and a tide table, and I get the daily newspaper, and that's about the size of it. We've had 15 quakes in the San Francisco Bay Area of 5 to 5.9, and 13 of those I've been right within 1 day. One I was off 2 days, and last August 8th, I have to admit I was 7 days off. But that's only because I switched allegiances to the eclipse of August 15th instead of staying with a straight old new moon of August 1st. Otherwise, I would have had that one in my window. So an earthquake-prone period, a seismic window, is really an expression of probabilities. It's certainly nothing mystical, and it's nothing that anyone can't do if they keep their minds open and don't reject the idea at the outset. Some of my friends have said, Jim, your severest critics you will never convince. So the best thing to do is outlive them. So I'm working on that, and looking around, I see a few others that may be working on the same program of vindication. I was raised in Sonoma Valley, barefoot, prune picker, crawfish catcher, and I was 27 years old before I felt my first earthquake, and as a native Californian, I really felt left out. Since that time, I've had more than my share of earthquake experiences. In fact, I think enough for a lifetime, but I really anticipate that the best or the worst is yet to come. I hope that I have a fairly good handle as we approach those critical periods as to just when they will happen. It's always better to have a little psychological defense. Forewarned is forearmed, as they say. Even so, when this quake occurred, it caught me a bit by surprise. Not completely, because I was in the county building. My boss was at the Giants game. I was anticipating going to Game 4 the next day. Had my ticket in my pocket. But at about 5:03, I went over to the front counter. The county saw fit to take my telephone away about a year earlier, so I didn't have a telephone at my desk. They also took away my assistant, gave me more work to do, and prevented me from having field work. It seems somehow you're not supposed to predict earthquakes. It was considered not to be part of my job. how we're predicting landslide areas and areas of flooding and areas of ground subsidence, those are all part of the normal geological field. But predicting earthquakes, that's astrology. We don't do that here. Not in flight circles. You don't discuss earthquakes ahead of time. So, well, they sent me home for 2.5 months and 15 days unpaid. And I'm going through the appeals procedure to make sure that we really do still have freedom of speech in this country. And I expect to be reimbursed. And I expect any tarnished reputation to be returned to me. But I do want to make clear at every opportunity that when I talk about earthquake predictions, it's not as the county geologist for Santa Clara County. It's as Jim Berkland, geologist, scientist. So a number of times I say that, and it gets clipped out of the newspaper item or out of the television tape, and so the county continues to gnash its teeth collectively. As I said, try to outlive your critics. There's something I want to just pass along to you because I got this just about 3 weeks ago. This is from my hometown newspaper, and they've been following my career quite closely up in Sonoma. And this is the editor's, Robert Lynch's, most complete listing of you know you're getting old when. And there's several of these you've got to hear. When you sit down in a rocking chair and you can't get it started, your back goes out more often than you do. You know all the answers, but nobody asks you the questions. Your little black book has only names ending in MD. Your mind makes agreements your body can't carry out. You finally get it all together, and then you forgot where you put it. Takes you an hour to undress, and another hour to remember why. You get worn out dialing long distance. I've been doing a lot of that lately. You feel like the morning after, and you haven't been anywhere. Anything under a quarter isn't worth picking up. The little old lady you help across the street is your wife. You sink your teeth into a thick, juicy steak, and they stay there. Your children begin to look middle-aged. The gleam in your eyes is the sun reflecting off your bifocals. And this is the one I really like. You finally get to the top of the ladder and it's leaning against the wrong wall. So, it's a lot of fun. In fact, I want to give you a little bit about the philosophy of what I've been involved in here. This is a little bit of prepared text. In all of the history of humanity, how many individuals have been able to grasp a sample of ultimate truth? Very, very few, I'm afraid. And if they actually held it, how many would recognize it? I'm afraid that truth, just like beauty, is in the eyes of the beholder. It doesn't matter if we're talking about an artist, an engineer, a scientist, or an economist. Truth change with time, and ultimate truth remain obscure. As a scientist, it has taken me a number of years to recognize that scientific facts are at all times merely progress reports. For example, when I took my first geology class 42 years ago, our textbooks told us that the Earth was 2 billion years old. I just got a copy of Warren Carey's book out here to make sure that things were still as they were last time I checked. Yes, textbooks now tell us the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Wow, time flies when you're having fun. I was taught that the ocean basins were featureless plains with just occasional volcanic mounts rising up to disturb the monotony. Now we know the oceanic world is more complicated, and the ocean basins are younger than the continents. See how easy it was, how simple it was when we didn't have the facts? Continental drift was a largely unsupported speculation with no known mechanism lending any credence to the concept. It was always told to the students with a large tongue and a cheek. And just as some wild idea, it just looked like it could fit South America and Africa together, but that was just coincidental. 40 years before I was born, Lord Kelvin, the leading world physicist, had something to say about the age of the Earth. He said it was about 20 million years old, possibly as much as 100 million, but his calculations were impeccable. Why, a body the size of the Earth, once molten and chilling slowly in space, would have a crust about the thickness of our Earth in about 20 million years. So how could it be any older than that? Geologists and other scientists bent their facts to fit this very young Earth relatively. Lord Kelvin, his calculations were precise, but he missed a very important fact. He knew nothing about radioactivity, which is keeping the cooker going. And so the crust, actually the mantle, is still warming up. Also, he asserted that sunspots had absolutely nothing to do with weather on the Earth. He said also that radio was an interesting toy, but would never amount to anything. So we can see that those people and boards and groups that concoct a ruling theory and try to live by it can do a lot of damage to free thinking. We must always probe the ruling theory, test it, believe our eyes instead of maybe what we were taught, and with the proviso that perhaps the ruling theory is really right. But just like ultimate truth, it's going to take a long time before we really know. So during his heyday, Lord Kelvin made a number of pronouncements and caused scientists to deny their own research, their own ideas, where it conflicted with the ruling theory. It's hardly necessary to point out that various aspects in our own lives today are affected by ruling theories. How we react to them varies with the time and the person. Always question. Scientific progress is not achieved by majority vote. During my geologic career, I've often found myself at odds with my colleagues and freely admit it adds a certain zest to life. However, I do not seek conflicts. I seek truth, although the trail to truth is mined with controversy. I've already selected my epitaph. Jim Berkland. He searched for truth, but here he lies. Well, cycles has had quite a role in my life, and I didn't know about it until recent years. In September of 1973, I arrived as the county geologist in Santa Clara County, their first ever, which is one of the reasons they didn't know quite what to do with me. I guess they thought for a while that all geologists made routine earthquake predictions. Actually, I didn't start for about 5 or 6 months. And then I tell people somewhat shamefacedly now that since nobody else was doing it, I fell into it by default. So, yeah, sorry about that. September through December, Santa Clara County and the environs was shaken by 6 small to moderate earthquakes, 2 of which I felt myself. And I had no idea about trying to predict quakes. All I did was note them in my day book and take calls from people that felt them and wanted reassurance. And then on January 8th, 1974, an article appeared in the newspaper, in fact, many newspapers around the country. And a name came up that I had never heard before, Fergus Wood. He's your program director for Cycles. A genius. And I know I'm very pleased. He responded to a couple of my letters with very great thoroughness and kindness. And but at the time, I didn't even recognize the name. In fact, I thought our own Santa Clara Valley Water District was really responsible for the concept that we might have some coastal flooding at the south end of San Francisco Bay due to an unusual astronomical alignment. Well, on that morning, seeing that in the paper, it just had a few things click in my head. I didn't know it before. And I said, well, certainly the moon affects the tides. What's so unusual about this one? Well, it was the first full moon of the year. And that moment of the full moon, when the moon was exactly opposite from the sun, not quite exactly because it wasn't an eclipse, but it was pretty close. That moment was only an hour and a half away from the closest approach of the moon in about 10 years. So each of those two factors are the main reasons for ocean tides. You get in a tug of war, the sun on one side, the moon on the other at the time of the full moon, and the waters bulge out, and the earth is rotating beneath, so you go through 2 high and 2 low tides a day if you're at the proper latitudes. Sometimes you just have 1 full tide a day. But then 2 weeks later, the moon's on the other side, and it's on the same side as the sun. We then have a new moon, and if it's right in front, we have an eclipse of the moon, eclipse of the sun in this case. So in either case, the tides are extreme. They're called spring tides, as the tides spring up. Nothing to do with the spring of the year. And they can be 20% higher just with the lineup, another 20% higher just with the closest approach called perigee, and the lineup is called syzygy, and those that got copies of my newsletters may wonder how to pronounce it if you aren't that familiar with it. But it means yoked together, like a team of oxen, from the Greek zygos. I use it in terms of linked together by common need and interest. People that want to know about earthquakes, they have information to provide and often no place to send it. So this syzygy and perigee, if they are on the same day, they become what Fergus Wood has called a perigean spring tide, when you have the spring tide combined with the perigee tide. And that's anytime the two events are less than 36 hours apart. And he, in his big masterwork out here, the strategic role of perigean spring tide in its later supplement, he has 600 years of these perigean spring tides. There wasn't room to put all of them in if he went clear to 36 hours, so the ones in his table are those of less than 25 hours separation between the syzygy and perigee. Well, I didn't know about all of that. All I knew about was this newspaper article, and not only was the sun, moon, and earth lined up at the same time as we're close to the moon, we're also within a week of the perihelion when we're closest to the sun. Once a year, we're only a little over 91.5 million miles instead of 95 million miles away from the sun, which we are in July. So we had all 3 major tide-raising forces at about the same time, which explained these very, very high tides. So Fergus Wood said, look out. The high tides will create a period of vulnerability to coastal flooding. Then all you need is the meteorology to put you over the top, to get you over the jetties and over the barriers. If you don't have the meteorology adding to the astronomy, you probably won't get your coastal flooding. But at least the conditions are there. You can predict conditions ripe for tornadoes. Maybe you won't get the tornado. You can predict conditions ripe for earthquakes, and maybe you won't get the earthquakes. 20% of the time I don't get my earthquakes, which is about what weather forecasters do, about 80% right, I understand. On that day, it occurred to me that if the oceans are being pulled out by these gravitational forces, perhaps the solid Earth is also yielding like a rubber ball. I didn't even know about Earth tides at that time, but there really are Earth tides, and the solid Earth moves up and down about 3 feet. 2 feet related to the moon and 1 foot from the sun. Might be a little surprising knowing how much larger the sun is. But the tide-raising force varies with the cube of the distance, and so the distance is almost all important. And puts to the lie anyone looking for tidal forces from the planets as being a major cause of earthquakes. I just can't see it. The sun, the planets Venus and Jupiter have less than 1,000th the effect on our tides that the moon has. So if we're really looking for a trigger on a trigger, perhaps. But I'm a long ways from being convinced that the planets have anything to do with it. Unless, again, there's some other factor that I don't know about. So on this little deduction, I went back to see if there were any examples of quakes that fit these maximum tides. So I got on my almanac and I went back to the 6 earthquakes that had preceded this announcement in January 74. All 6 fit the idea. Day after the full moon, 2 days after the new moon, day of perigee. And I said, hey, there's a prime time for earthquakes, at least in the Bay Area. And if things continue as they have since September, we ought to have a pretty good jolt around here in the next week. So to my co-workers at the county building, I said, hey, I can expect a quake of 4 to 5 magnitude here in a week. Oh, well, they didn't know quite what to make of that. And then I talked to a geologist with the California Division of Mines and Geology, and we were talking about future contracts and investigating the geology of Santa Clara County, and I mentioned, you know, if it continues as it has, we should have a quake here because the tides are really, really extreme today. And he very quickly changed the subject. Didn't want to deal with it at all, and because it might tarnish his reputation, of course. 2 days later, a 4.4 shook Santa Clara County. I was mildly pleased and said, well, this is really simple. Why isn't everybody using the tides to predict earthquakes? Now, I did not know that this same concept has been reinvented time after time. And people have pursued the idea with varying degrees of success. Those that have really taken all of the world earthquakes and tried to fit them into this pattern have generally met with failure, because there are earthquakes and there are earthquakes. Surely we have the same sun and moon, but we have different geological structures and orientations and shapes of the faults and types of movements, heat flow changes. All of these seem to affect the timing of the quakes. So you can only know what your own seismic window is by looking at the past. Remember the famous statement, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Santayana. Like, I changed that just a bit on my newsletter. You can see it says, we can learn from the past, but first we must know it. And sometimes the past has been distorted. And I don't think we'll have time to go into it today, but in 1979, I independently deduced and explored the possibilities that the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco had not killed a few hundred, but rather 5,000 to 10,000 people, which is what the early reports said, and then that was squelched by the government. There was a definite cover-up because it was bad for business, and Eastern investors didn't want to come back and replace all this money. And besides, earthquakes were too mysterious. They could handle fire, but not earthquakes, so suddenly it was the fire that did most of the damage. And the San Franciscans were quite bright. You know, when they first said 50% of the damage is by the earthquakes, and then the insurance company said, we're not going to pay anything for the earthquake damage, we'll pay for fire. Well, the fire damage went up to 95% very quickly. And the San Franciscans always talked about the San Francisco fire rather than the earthquake. And they always downplayed the deaths because most tragedies, natural catastrophes, are rated on the basis of how many people die. And so they kept comparing it with floods and hurricanes and fires and other kinds of disasters around the world. And we only lost 452 or 277 or 478 or 498 or whatever number they thought would sell. But the real number is thousands. And some that may be able to get a copy of this new book by the city historian Gladys Hansen in San Francisco. It came out on December 7th, rather appropriately. It's titled Denial of Disaster. And she got hold of some records I was told did not exist, the burial records for San Francisco. And I said, what happened to them? Well, they were lost in the fire. And I said, that's rather odd because you weren't accumulating them until during and after the fire. Well, that's what they told us. Well, she got hold of the actual records, and her total was over 3,600 burials. And that doesn't include the thousands that were totally cremated by the temperatures of 2,700 degrees. When I suggested this back in 1979 to the Geological Survey, I was informed They didn't want to deal with it. The whole topic was too morbid. I said, well, history is rather morbid, and so is archaeology and paleontology. But how are we going to learn from the past unless we know what the past really was? His story. Was his story accurate? You can only know that if you've lived it yourself. Otherwise, it's second or third or fourth hand. So you go back as close to the sources as you can in order to find out what the story really was. So that's another item, but it's another place where I've been in conflict with the ruling theory. And I was part of that ruling theory for many years. I taught universities on the east and west coast. Why weren't more people killed in San Francisco? Well, the fire did the damage and the people moved out ahead of the fire, not those that were trapped in the collapsed buildings. Well, it is a bit morbid, true, and I found that after this World Series earthquake, I didn't want to deal with the dead because it was too real, too personalized. And whereas I pored over the death list in 1906, I wasn't that much interested in the 67 people who died this time. Maybe in a few years, maybe next year, but right now it's just a little too fresh. And I'm sure the same thing was true in 1906 by the investigators at that time. So I made my first prediction and it hit 2 days later, and I made another prediction for February, and that one hit. The night before Thanksgiving Day, I noticed at a trip to the library in Menlo Park, U.S. Geological Survey, that they were having a meeting that night on earthquake predictions. And I thought, this is a good place to go and give my ideas. I worked with the Geological Survey for about 6 years, and I knew these pick and hammer meetings were, well, I wouldn't quite call them beer busts, but something like that. And a lot of wild ideas came out and sometimes turned into very meaningful papers. So I thought, this is a good place to spring this notion about tides and quakes. I again thought I was a voice in the wilderness in such matters. I was not allowed to speak that night, unfortunately. Nobody predicted a quake that night, although I handed out written tables and a prediction that we would have 3.5 to 5.5 within a week, because the next day there was going to be an eclipse of the moon, and we hadn't had a strong quake in 5 years. The next day was Thanksgiving Day, and my wife was fixing a turkey at home. She's from New Brunswick, Canada, and never felt an earthquake before. At 3:01, it hit. My daughter and I were at the movies. 1974, November 28th, Thanksgiving Day. We were at the movies. We felt the quake but didn't recognize it because it was the first run of the movie Earthquake, and we thought it was part of the special effects. I came on and turned on the car radio and I said, what is this? Is it Orson Welles at work again? I mean, they're talking about this big earthquake. I saw Los Angeles just destroyed, and this came, oh, it's a real quake. Felt from Santa Rosa to Modesto and Monterey, and I looked at my watch. Oh, darn, it's 9 hours early. It wasn't supposed to happen until after midnight. Well, I adjusted my theory following that and the next 5 magnitude quake in the Bay Area, which was the Coyote Lake quake in 1979. Again, I owe Dr. Wood a debt of gratitude because in 1979, I made 3 predictions originally, and then as we approached in February, I looked ahead and I said, how come August? It looks astronomically as if the ocean tides should be higher than they are in September, but that seems to be reversed. So I wrote Dr. Wood a letter, and he responded and pointed out that the ocean tides do not always match precisely the earth tides. The earth tides are usually at a maximum right under the moon. When the moon's right at the zenith, where it's 4,000 miles closer to this point on Earth than it was when it rose over in the east, because it didn't have the radius of the Earth in the way. So the earth tide usually lags within an hour or so of the zenith of the moon, but the ocean tides may lag 3 days, or they may precede the maximum astronomical forces by 3 days. And that's because the perigee can be very critical. If the perigee is 3 days before the new or full moon, often the highest tides split the difference. And sometimes the perigee is almost exactly between the new and full moon, 8 days or 7 days from one or the other, in which case for the month there's usually no outstanding tide. It's just sort of spread out evenly. And that then is not a very likely earthquake month. For example, this year, September will be like that. and you could go with one new or full moon, and wouldn't make much difference. And the same thing has happened last August. So, as a result of the response from Dr. Wood, I added in the August 7th through 14th seismic window, sent it into the USGS in Golden, Colorado as one of my 4 predictions for the year, and they did affirm when the Coyote Lake quake hit 5.9 on August 6th that I had predicted for the 7th through the 14th. Well, again, it was a day early. I was waiting for the maximum stress, and it preceded it. I thought, what's going wrong with my model here? Oh, I've got a static model with the Earth just here in this gravity field and not rotating. As you approach the maximum stress, the Earth is feeling a higher force than maybe it had experienced in 6 months. The fault lines have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. Today's stress may be adequate if the fault is at a threshold level, if the water pore pressure is almost ready to overcome the frictional resistance to movement. Then this additional tidal stress can make all the difference. So I adjusted my window forward. Usually now my windows open the day before the new or full moon, but they may open up to 2 days before the new or full moon. And then they close 2 days earlier too. So they're always 8-day windows. With no more than one predictable window per month, I have about 1/4 of the time, 8 days out of 30, 31. And I should be hitting about 1/4 of the quakes, about 25%. But I've been hitting 3 out of 4. And in 1979, the USGS in Golden, Colorado phoned me rather excitedly and said, Jim, the computer just spit out your name. We've analyzed your first 5 years of predictions and you've hit the 99 percentile level. There's only one chance in 100 that this is accidental. But we think you've been lucky. They continue to think so. I hear this all the time. And now I'm hearing, well, he's bound to hit something. He makes dozens of predictions a week. I make 1 or 2 a month. But they have to find an explanation, have to downplay the success because they are not succeeding. The last time they commented along this line, I came up with a line, which I guess I'll use in my book, that my critics who call upon luck to explain my successes are flying in the face of the fact that luck is mainly a mystical approach. So if they call upon mysticism to explain my success, perhaps they should have their own credentials examined. This 1974, I hit 6 out of 8. 1975, I had just 2 predictions. The very first prediction, I actually, that year, wrote out my theory, 1 page, syzygy, perigee, and seismicity, and listed the likely periods. And the very first period was January 26th through February 3rd, 1975. I handed it out in January. On February 3rd, in Haicheng, China, February 4th their time, across the date line, the 7.3 magnitude quake essentially destroyed Haicheng, a city of over 100,000 people. Relatively few lives were lost because they had predicted it. They had evacuated the city a few hours before this massive major earthquake, and they had used animal reactions, patterns of earthquakes in the vicinity and through time, tilt of the ground, water level changes, magnetic field changes, gravity changes, radon gas release. One of the critical things was what the animals were doing. This is the famous place where on February frosts sweeping this area around Haicheng, snakes crawled out of their holes and froze to death on the surface. They had been hibernating, something drove them out. One snake was found, front half frozen solid, his tail still twitching down in the hole. A lady here in Pasadena called me early in October 1987, about 3 days after your Whittier earthquake, originally called 6.1 and then downgraded to 5.9, but around a 6. She said, Mr. Berkland, have you ever heard anything like this? I called Caltech, and they're not interested, and they said, you might be. She said, I'm an organic gardener, and it really troubled me that the day before the earthquake, all of my earthworms crawled up on the surface and baked to death in the heat of the day. Have you ever heard such a thing? And I said, well, yes, it sounds like the snakes. Also, in the book, When the Snakes Awake, by Helmut Tribuch. If you haven't heard that name, remember it. Helmut Tribuch. Tributesch. And this book is called When the Snakes Awake. He found himself in a similar position to which I find myself, going against the popular scientific view. And when he tried to publish in this country on what he had observed in and around Friuli, Italy in 1976, he found great rejection and they would not publish his book. The same thing was true in England. So he published in his native German. It was so good that it was picked up by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has been reprinted several times. When the Snakes Awake. You can buy it in softcover for less than $10. And it has at least 2 instances of worms crawling up on the surface and dying. It has a number of instances of magnetic field changings rapidly before earthquakes, of radio signals prior to quakes. His comment was really plaintive in the foreword of the book. His family lived in northern Italy. When he was working in the Andes, he rushed back after the big near 7 magnitude quake, I believe a 6.8. It occurred 1 week after the eclipse of the moon on May 7th, 1976. He found much of the village destroyed. His family was still a few injuries, but no deaths. And all of his reports came in from his friends and neighbors, family. 3 cases where mother cats had taken their kittens out of the houses and left them out in the shrubbery. 1 case where a mother dog did the same thing. A farmer was highly perturbed to see rats and mice running around his barnyard in broad daylight, and none of his 5 cats to be found. They came back 2 days after the quake. Similar to what Darwin reported when he was in Concepcion, Chile in 1835 on his voyage of the Beagle. A great earthquake, an 8, hit while he was there in Concepcion, the Beagle anchored out in the harbor. He said quake hit around noontime. There were very, very few clues that such a quake was imminent, except the seabirds flew miles inland and all the dogs ran to the hills. Sometimes animals do know something our multi-million-dollar black boxes do not know. Nature has much to tell us if we'll only listen. So, Helmut, finding all this resistance to publishing his data, he said he was sensitive to the fact that it wasn't an accepted scientific concept. But he said, when you get all of these reports from people whom you know and trust and have no reason to doubt, then there are severe challenges of conscience. Should you just sit on and be quiet and not affect your reputation, or should you go up front? And he went up front, resulting in the book. And most of us can benefit by reading a book such as that. In the very first time that I had printed that syzygy, perigee, and seismicity was that 1975, and as I say, the very first window, we did not get a local quake in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, but the biggest quake in the world in several months occurred, and that was the Haicheng quake. The big quake a year later in 1976, which the Chinese did not predict, but could have predicted. They had a lot of evidence, but the Gang of Four had taken the scientists out to doing useful work, like harvesting rice. They had broken up this network of 100,000 observers around China, and there was no forecast, no alert about the 8 magnitude Tangshan earthquake that killed 655,000 people, according to independent observers. After 2 years in which China had nothing to say about it, they finally said, well, there's been much exaggeration. The true total was 242,000, still a pretty large population. But that was on the day of the new moon that quake occurred. And the next day, a 7.2 magnitude aftershock came and knocked down what little was standing. So in there are a number of little anecdotes that we can go through year by year, but I've made over 300 earthquake predictions, and I've hit over 230, and that's in 16 years. In 1989, in January, I sat down and looked ahead. Now I have Fergus Wood's book. I can look ahead till the year 2200. I can look back to the year 1600 and see what the tides were doing around the time of the past earthquakes. And he had quite a bibliography in his book about tides and quakes. And then I got hold of his book in 1979. I'd been at my efforts for 5 years and had limped along without a computer and tried to determine past nodal points of the moon and a few other significant things. And he has a table with it all there. It had already done the work for me, and I hadn't known it. Well, anyway, in January of last year, I put together all of the monthly top tidal periods and called in my seismic windows. And one was October 14th to 21st. It really was the top astronomical tidal window in 3 years. You had to go back to December 31st of 1986 for a stronger gravitational field. It turns out the ocean tides didn't match that precisely. They only hit an 8-foot range. The syzygy is about 20% higher, the perigee is about 20% higher, but you get the two on the same day. This only happens from 2 to 5 times a year. Then you have this synergistic effect, and tides are frequently 100% higher than the normal. So at the Golden Gate, they're usually 4 to 4.5 feet. At the time of perigean spring tides, they're usually in excess of 8 feet, and occasionally in excess of 9 feet. And let me alert you now to this coming December. On December 2nd and December 31st, the tides are going to reach 9.1 feet at the Golden Gate, within 1/10 of a foot of the maximum we've recorded there. The only time I've seen it higher than that was 9.2 on December 31st, 1986. And on that basis, I had predicted a window for December 29th through January 5th, I believe. And it was published in the Examiner, San Francisco Examiner, and KCBS picked up on it and called me at home on Sunday, and you really believe this? And the Examiner said, Jim Berkland seems to be the only scientist that's not blasé about these upcoming record high tides. And he thinks there's going to be a 3.5 to 5.5 magnitude quake during that week. Well, that tape recording of my prediction came over the radio. About 6:45 the next morning, I was just getting ready to go to work. And I heard myself make the prediction, and I mentioned about the 9.2-foot tides, and I said, oh boy, somebody is going to say, I'm calling for a 9.2 magnitude quake. So I'd better put my recorder by there. The next time they play this thing, I will have it documented what I actually said. At 7:25, the 4.6 came rolling through, shook the county building. I had calls from my colleagues that had arrived early, calls from a number of the media people. The quake was on schedule, first day of my window. But they never played my prediction again, so I wasn't able to document what I'd said. Once the quake happens, it's kind of old news. And that happens again and again. So the next time the tides were almost that good was October 14th of last year. So I assigned that a 75% probability for a 3.5 to 5.5 magnitude quake in the Bay Area. And then as we approached that date, several things happened. There were water well changes. Springs began to flow much more voluminously than they had during a time of drought. And we know later that radio signals emanated from a station within 5 miles of the epicenter by stress in the crust, probably stressing the quartz minerals in the crust, and quartz is piezoelectric. Same kind of thing has been reported prior to the Coalinga quake, the big quake in Chile in 1960 at 8.9. 6 days before, tremendous burst of radio signals in the AM band that caused Radio Chile difficulty in getting around the country. So it's not that new. Those of us that saw, hey, Stanford scientists just recognized radio signals. It's old hat. It's never been accepted by the USGS. In fact, when the Stanford's professor came out and said, this is what he found, they said it's just coincidence. But very quickly they changed on that one. Now they're installing these same kind of receivers near Parkfield because they don't want to miss any bases in predicting the Parkfield earthquake. Time's getting to be of the essence for them. So they may install some animals along there before long. I would hope so. But so as we approached this October 14th date, I'd been watching, thanks to a physicist with Xerox, Antonio Nafarati, I'd been watching since 1979 the comings and goings of animals. Now, I never would have thought of looking at the lost and found column to predict quakes had it not been for Antonio. When he called me at home, I was having dinner, and he said, I agree with your upcoming seismic window because the cats are disappearing again. I thought, what's this? You've got a whole family full of cats here at his house. How do you know that? Well, I look at the Mercury News Lost and Found column, and I see that there's a higher number of lost cats just before quakes. I had to fight this tendency to hang up on him because I was hungry, and, and this is outlandish. And I said, oh, how long have you been doing this? And I could see he was seriously studying this. He believed it was a change in the gravity field that animals were able to detect. He thought they had some kind of a mechanism to detect changes in gravity, and that's how they could home in, and that they were disturbed prior to quakes. Well, certainly there are gravity changes prior to quakes. We still do not know any mechanism by which they can detect that gravity field. But in the interim, we have learned how they can detect changes in the magnetic field. And that's a really exciting story. But when he called me on that day, and he mentioned several quakes I knew about, and gave me the numbers, and I said, how long in advance do the animals run away, the cats run away? He said, it looks like a week to 10 days. And then it takes a few days for the people to put the ad in the paper, so by the time you see the numbers really increase, the quake is almost on you. And I said, well, how did you come up with that timing? He said, well, not only the quakes, but I also noticed the 4th of July effect. When we have a very loud series of noises from the firecrackers and all the fireworks and all the excitement from the kids, the dogs especially panic. Now, he wasn't paying much attention to dogs, but I certainly have since that time, 1979. Our own dog, our big Samoyed, ripped out our screen door on July 4th of 1986. She didn't try to run away because she's an outside dog. I think that's a valid statement. Animals seem to want to leave their normal places of security on first awareness of an earthquake. And that sounds rather odd. Why don't they seek security? Why don't people seek security? When the ground begins to shake, they all say, let me out of here. Forget this business of hiding under a desk or something. I want out of this building. It turns your whole world topsy-turvy. And so you do what the animals do, but you usually do it a little later, at the time of the shaking. The animals seem to get this message, electromagnetic field change of some kind, a week to 10 days in advance of the quake, and a small percentage of pets run away. Many of them do hide under the house and in the closet and on your lap and want reassurance, but those do not appear as newspaper items. Only those which run away and which the owners are unable to find in a few days. They'll put up the posters and they'll drive around the neighborhood and finally say, I'm going to spring for $30, $40, $50 and put an ad in the paper. I've seen ads for $10,000 for a dog and $5,000 for a cat. Usually they're movie stars that pay that much. But, commonly, you pay over $100 or so for a dog, and usually the cat is not valued as highly. But, and also you give a cat more leeway. Oh, so the cat's missing, he'll come back in 2 or 3 days. We know what he's doing. But, dogs get out in the street and they get smashed, they get lost, they get adopted, and so there's other reasons. We're much more anxious about our missing dogs. So there's generally 3 or 4 times as many dog ads as cat ads. Also, the dogs are much more responsive to thunderstorms on New Year's Eve and 4th of July. So every year, at those times when we have those events, I look ahead to see large numbers of missing dogs. Indeed, instead of the normal 20 or 25 missing dogs in the Mercury News on a daily basis, the record is 88, July 9th, 1980. Second high, 85, July 9th, 1982. The third high, October 26th, 1989, 81. The earthquake drove them away. But the earthquake didn't bother the dogs as much as the 4th of July does. The cats, however, another story. There are normally 3 or 4 missing, and then it gradually crept up through the years as more people put ads in. There was 6 or 8, typical day through early 1987, 89. And then on September 26th, they hit 27. And on the same day, 57 missing dogs. No 4th of July, no thunderstorm. What does it mean? It means a quake is coming, and I bet my boss at the office that we were going to have a big jolt within a couple of weeks. It didn't happen. So then he says, pay me my dollar. So I said, I think it may be one of these cases where before bigger quakes you get a greater advance warning. This is what the Chinese have found. A bigger anomaly, larger, greater time in advance. It may be waiting for this maximum tidal force in the window in October. So on October 13th, Friday the 13th of October, the animals had come down from their September highs and then rapidly climbed up again, back up to 18 cats and 58 dogs. The dogs had gone even higher. So I called the Gilroy Dispatch, and those of you who got copies of my newsletter have a little insert there, and said, is World Series quake coming? I called them and I said, raise that 75% probability to 85%. Raise the top magnitude to 6. It may be stronger. I really think a 6.5 or 7, but I don't want to frighten anybody. If they see a 6, that'll give them an idea. And informally, a lot of people heard what I was saying. People bought earthquake insurance, anchored their hot water tanks. One lady took down over $5,000 worth of crystal in China and reported that correctly, I presume, to the USA Today article in late October. And so there is some good, some practical advantage to knowing when quakes are going to occur. Not only this emotional preparation, passing along to your kids what quakes can do and what they can't do, and making your own preparations. I bought an emergency generator for the first time. I bought a radio scanner for the first time and a CB unit. Made sure we had a lot of extra water. We had earthquake insurance. So I put my money where my mouth is. One lady called me on Sunday before the quake. Jim, I hear it's going to be a quake. Is it going to be a big one? I said, yes, I think so. Should I take down my china? And I said, well, you know, that's a personal decision. But if you've ever seriously considered doing that, I think now is the time. The quake happened 2 days later. She called me up that night. What do we do now? And I said, did you take down your china? And she said, no, my husband thought it would look stupid. So I said, well, why call me now if you don't pay attention to what I said? So, you know, there's some pluses and minuses. And you can't be right all the time. You can't get everybody to believe what you say. You know, that's the way of the world. But just provided enough people can learn from the past so we don't have to repeat it. What did I say? To avoid a negative train of thought, leave your reservations behind. That prediction didn't seem to create the furor that it might have in terms of just foreknowledge. The USGS was not very happy about it, of course, but the county seemed to accept it. In fact, there was some favorable comment. A number of people came in, thank you for telling us about it. Then, within 1 week, things began to change. Somehow, a rumor got started by somebody that I was predicting an 8 magnitude quake for November. The Oakland Tribune said, Jim Berkland claims he's predicted the World Series quake, and now he's calling for another 7 between November, was it 13th to 20th, something like that. And I called him up on that night, which was Monday night after the Tuesday earthquake. And I said, I didn't say it, I don't believe it, I've been trying to talk this down for a long time. It's a standard major shock. It wasn't a foreshock. We've never had twin 7s in this state. I don't believe that's 7, and it might frighten some people that do take it seriously, so I want a retraction, and they retracted it the next morning. So I went out into the field working with the people that had a lot landslide damage and home damage and trying to set up a survey control of moving landslides and that sort of thing. Got back into the office and the boss called me aside and said, "How could you do such a thing?" And I said, "Do what?" "Well, you predicted this big earthquake and now the public is panicked and you caused all this trouble for the Board of Supervisors and the county executive." And I said, "I didn't do it. We have word to the contrary." Well, the word they had to the contrary came from the U.S. Geological Survey. And they'd gone to the state geologist and they said, "We've got to do something about this guy. He's interfering with our earthquake recovery program." So when I pointed out I'd already got a retraction on the 7, I certainly wasn't thinking about an 8. They didn't really want to hear that because the county officials had already gone to the media and told them, the press and the world, what a bad boy I was and how they were sending me home on suspension. And so I called my wife immediately, and she had already heard about it from a friend who saw it on the TV news. So that's why I have a little appeal going, and perhaps a suit. So we won't be discussing that too much more, but I still think we have freedom of speech in this country, and it is responsible to tell the public the best of your knowledge. Whether you are a meteorologist predicting that Hugo's going to come ashore near Charleston, South Carolina, I hope members of Cycle remember and drag out your old June-July issue, which was sent to me. There's a meteorologist in Cycles that published an article, said that this upcoming September-October will be a prime time for an earthquake, for a hurricane path to cross through Charleston, South Carolina.
Was that Frank Silsby?
Must have been he. Okay? And so you had several months warning. Now you would not have seen that in the standard meteorological journal, I feel quite sure. But there's this responsibility, a public responsibility. You don't owe that much responsibility to your colleagues because they don't really know what you're doing. They don't know where you're coming from. These people have said, "Oh, Berkland, it's a little better than flipping a coin, a little better than reading tea leaves. We don't discuss Berkland and his theory. We have our own theory about Berkland." On and on and on. What Berkland wants more than anything else is fame. I said, what I want more than anything else is to be right, to advance science. And why don't they once invite me up to discuss what I've been doing? I keep getting cold shouldered by high science. So I'm pleased with opportunities like today to talk to informed people and give them my ideas. Now the main topic, which dropped out of the data, I have over 2,400 earthquakes that have shaken the San Francisco Bay Area since 1800 on my computer now. And we cannot ignore the fact that the quake that we got on October 17th was a dead ringer for the quake we got in 1865. I'm going to share another little thing with you I found just before flying down here. I went back to some old newspaper records, which I've been doing a lot of in the recent years, and they talk about the earthquake. This is in the Daily Chronicle Dramatic. It was a freebie. It was the Chronicle, ancestor of the modern San Francisco Chronicle, was a free newsletter handed out dealing mainly with the vaudeville and plays and drama in San Francisco, and a lot of ads, and a few articles, some of which are quite interesting. But they talk about this being the big quake. It said every time we have an earthquake around here, the comparisons always come up. Was that the biggest one we ever felt? And they said this one's in a class by itself. October 8th, 1865. And then I saw this little article here. Earthquake Almanac, October 16th. At the insistence of several friends who feel a boding anxiety to know beforehand what sort of phenomena we may expect the elements to exhibit during the next month or two, and who have lost all confidence in the various patent medical almanacs because of the unaccountable reticence of those works concerning the extraordinary event of the 8th of this month, I have compiled the following almanac expressly for this latitude, and ironically it begins with October 17th. Weather hazy, atmosphere murky and dense, an expression of profound melancholy will be observable upon most countenances. October 18th, slight earthquake, countenances grow more melancholy. And how about this line? October 19th, look out for rain. It would be absurd to look in for it. The general depression of spirits increased. October 20th, more weather. October 21st, same. October 23rd, mild balmy earthquakes. October 24th, shaky. October 25th, occasional shakes, followed by light showers of bricks and plaster. October 26th, considerable phenomenal atmospheric foolishness. About this time, expect more earthquakes, but do not look out for them on account of bricks. November 1st, terrific earthquake. This is the great earthquake month. More stars fall and more worlds are slathered around carelessly and destroyed in November than any other month of the year. November 2nd, spasmodic but exhilarating earthquakes, accompanied by occasional showers of rain in churches and things. November 3rd, make your will. November 4th, sell out. November 5th, select your last words. November 8th, the sun will rise as usual, perhaps, but if he does, will doubtless be staggered some to find nothing but a large round hole 8,000 miles in diameter in the place where this world was serenely spinning the day before. And I thought, this guy is really good. It was a letter to the editor. Can anybody guess who signed it? Mark Twain. And I don't know if anybody else has stumbled onto this. This is priceless. And a round hole 8,000 miles in diameter is the first person that was discussing a black hole. So anyway, 1865. What was so similar about that quake? It was the largest felt by most living people. It occurred in October, which is one of the 3 months in which most Bay Area quakes that are damaging occur. March, April, and October have by far the largest number of damaging earthquakes in the Bay Area history, probably related to the equinoxes. Now, we've heard about the harvest moon of September. The full moon in October is called the hunter's moon. It's the first full moon after the autumnal equinox. On October 14th, the hunter's moon occurred only 5 hours before the closest approach of the moon in 3 years. You had to go back to that December 86 period for a closer approach and a higher probability seismic window. The two events, 5 hours apart. They can be 8 days apart. Only from 2 to 5 times a year is the syzygy perigee on the same day. This was the best in 3 years. The moon has a parallax, apparent diameter, and the closer it is, the bigger it is. It can get to about 61 minutes, 32 seconds. Well, this time it was 61 minutes, 28 and a half seconds. Pretty darn close. Within a few hundred miles of its closest possible approach. In 1865, it was 61 minutes, 26 seconds, and just slightly further out. And it was also in the 4 days after the hunter's moon of October 4th, 4 days after the closest approach of the moon of that year. And the two events were 7 hours apart. Extremely unusual situation. A World Series quake, 4 days after hunter's moon, 4 days after the closest perigee in 3 years. 1865, 4 days after hunter's moon, 4 days after the closest approach of the moon for the year. Both quakes about 7 magnitude. Both quakes caused severe damage in San Jose and Santa Cruz, caused the road in between to be blocked by avalanches and boulders, caused severe damage to buildings on the filled ground in San Francisco, caused dry streams to flow, tremendous change in well water and spring effects. In the same place, in the southern Santa Cruz Mountains on the San Andreas Fault. That was 124 years ago, 1865, and it caused me to look into Fergus Wood's tables to see if we had similar conditions 124 years before then, and there were. In the hunter's moon of 1741, and the hunter's moon of 1627, and next at the hunter's moon in the year 2113. So we only have 2 right now of those 5 dates that I've been looking at, 2 for sure earthquakes, and you can use carbon-14 and you can date past seismic events in many cases, but usually it's plus or minus a big number. So we may never know until the year 2013 if this cycle is real, but it may well be. And I think it's important to know. In 1984, there was a 6.2 magnitude earthquake called the Morgan Hill earthquake, and I had predicted a 6 magnitude quake to hit Santa Clara County. In late 1983, I said it should hit in 1984. Well, when? Probably in March, April, or October, and I have letters from several organizations that verify that I told them it. But what day? And I said, well, I'll try to work on that as we approach the day and watch the animals and hear reports from people and hear about water well changes, a number of other things that may occur. And I happened to be in Hawaii just before that quake. And the day I got back with the family, I got together all the old newspaper clippings that had been missing and clipped them all out. On the morning of the quake, I noticed that we just had 42 missing dogs, which was the high in several months. I put an exclamation point after that, but I didn't know what to do with it. And then at 1:30 that afternoon, 1:15 that afternoon, I found out what it meant. And that was kind of an enjoyable earthquake. In fact, exhilarating earthquake is a pretty good term. This last one was frightening. The only time I've really been scared from an earthquake, I guessed it. I said, this is a major quake. We got a 7 here. And they say 15 seconds. Felt more like 15 years. I mean, bookcases and drawers, and file cabinets toppling over, especially all my books in the open to the east, just poured out onto the floor. I could not see my office floor. And I was mighty glad when it stopped. And we got downstairs, and the gal from the executive office says, thanks to you, Jim, we just got earthquake insurance 2 weeks ago. And she lived in Los Gatos, and I'll bet she needed it. Another fellow had said that he had strapped his hot water tank just the night before. Where did you think that happened? Where do you think the epicenter was? I said, probably over by Highway 17 in Santa Cruz Mountains. Well, we heard it was in Hollister, and I said, no way. So we can tell pretty much the direction. Everything knocked off in the facing east, so the direction was from the west. That's one idea. And you can tell about how far away it is by the separation between the P wave, which is like a truck hitting your house, and the S wave, which is the real shaky time, as the S waves come rolling through. And if there's a 5-second separation between the two, the epicenter is about 25 miles away. It's about like lightning and thunder, where you count to 5, and it's a mile away for each 5 seconds. So strictly based on the different velocities of the main waves that were recorded. So the Richter scale is also quite useful. There's some people that want to eliminate it, probably because Charles Richter died a couple of years ago and no longer can defend it, I guess. But people, a lot of seismologists out there that like to have a scale named after them, see, so they're working on it. But people can relate to it. They can usually come up with pretty close estimates once they felt a few earthquakes. Well, that 1984 quake, why did I pick that year as being a year for the first 6 magnitude quake since 1911? 1911, in January, San Jose had its greatest rainfall in history, 12.38 inches of rain in January 1911. In March, another 6.5 inches of rain, the 3rd wettest March on record. On July 1st, 5 days after the new moon of June 26th and 5 days after the closest approach of the moon for the year, we got a 6.6 magnitude quake. If I'd been the county geologist then, knowing what I know now, I'd have predicted it. I feel quite confident. But we hadn't had a 6 since then. But in 1983, the all-time wettest calendar year in San Jose history, 32.5 inches. Our average yearly total is about the same as Los Angeles, about 13.5 inches. We had 32.5 inches in just 1 year, 83. That builds up the water table, it increases the surface loading of lakes, and seems to increase pore pressure to a point where earthquakes are more likely. I thought that was a unique idea with me. I don't know if I've ever had a unique idea. It's every time you research something, you find somebody else thought of it first. There's an article that appeared from Chinese Huang, who was at USC, and he and 4 other authors down here published a paper that in Southern California, all of their 6 magnitude quakes have followed a pattern of a couple of years of drought followed by 1 or more exceptionally heavy rainfall years. Well, we had, at that point, our greatest drought in our history, 75, 77. 78 through 83 were the 6 wettest years on record, topped off by the 3rd wettest and the single wettest year, 82 and 83. And then in 84, on April 24th, April again, we got the 6.2, the strongest quake since 1911. I should have known that date because the rainfall record year we broke was 1889. 25.5 inches of rain in San Jose. Guess what happened on April 24th, 1890? 6 magnitude earthquake, San Andreas Fault, very close to where the World Series quake was. Wasn't strong, but it was called in the Salinas Daily Index the worst quake felt by the oldest inhabitants. So those that remembered 1865 were gone, I guess, but 1890 was a big one, April 24th. Then there's one more little aspect I want to tell you about, the echo effect. I coined that term this year when in looking back through the records, it became very clear that once you get into a cycle of increasing frequency and magnitude of earthquakes, they tend to rebound in the San Francisco Bay Area across the bay. If a big one's in the West Bay, then it tends to bounce within 2 to 6 years in the East Bay. And you can look at 1836, when about a 6.5 hit the Hayward Fault, 1838, about an 8 magnitude on the San Francisco Peninsula, a great earthquake. 1865, southern Santa Cruz Mountains. 1868, Hayward. About a 7.5. That quake was called the big one until 1906 in the Bay Area. Then in 1890, we had the quake on the southern Santa Cruz Mountains. 1892, 2 quakes in the East Bay of about 7 magnitude in April 19th and April 21st. Then in 1898, maybe it was March, they had one in the East Bay near Mare Island. 1906, the biggie over on near San Francisco, not too far from the Golden Gate Bridge, now where that is. And then in 1911, 5 years later, back on the east side. And then no 6 magnitude quakes until 1984. But back in 1955, most people in San Jose, when I arrived in 1973, remembered that quake. And they said, oh yeah, that was a pretty good jolt. Day before Labor Day, 1955. The 55 was a very heavy rainfall year also. It happened September 4th, and then in October, there was another, it was March of the 1957, we had the Daly City quake back over on the West Bay. So those were not 6 magnitudes, they were not stronger than what we'd call moderate, but there was an echo effect even for those quakes. Now there seems to be no question that we are in a cycle of larger, more frequent earthquakes. I think this echo effect has a very high probability of occurring. I think we have at least 2 years, but no more than 6 years to prepare. Well, I made this statement in January to the Gilroy Dispatch, and of course they went to check with the experts, and they said, oh, it's purely hypothetical. Berkland has no evidence for that. Last week, there's a headline from a USGS scientist saying, there's a high probability of a big quake in the Hayward Fault within 2 to 5 years. Well, it's nice they can learn. It shows we're making progress. I just wish they would be a little more fair in their treatment of science and their objectivity. Maybe, how's the time going here? Well, I do want to have some questions, so I'm going to mention this last thing. If you pull out today's Los Angeles Times, you will see something that's a little disturbing to me. 57 lost and found dogs. That is the second high total on record, and watching it daily since 1981. And I have it, if you would like to check the record. And so people that say I'm an enthusiast, not a scientist, I said, hey, haven't you ever heard of an enthusiastic scientist? It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your cat is? Well, these are the records daily for San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Jose missing dogs and cats. And the highest on record for the LA Times was 62, just after the 4th of July in 1987. It just beat the record of 54 set the previous month in late June, when you had the greatest thunderstorm here in 30 years. My daughter is at UCLA, and she said the students were out on the little balconies at the dormitories, enjoying the show. And then there'd be massive applause when there's a particularly good one, like Steve Spielberg is at work. Yeah, right here. And 8.5, no, 9.2. They're giving it ratings from the... So, sure enough, within a week, 54 missing dogs. We didn't have any thunderstorm last I heard around here. We didn't have any 4th of July in the last few days. I think we're going to have an earthquake within a very few days close to Los Angeles. And if this doesn't work out, I'll chalk it up to the 20% that don't. But you heard it here first. So I'll wrap it up with that, and I'd sure like to take any questions you have.
What magnitude?
Okay, in my newsletter, I predicted a 5 by February 20th. In my other records, I've said a 6 by April. I'm really expecting we're not going to get less than a 4 out of this, probably in the 5 category. If it's way off in the desert, it'll probably be a 6 plus. As I hope, if we get a 6 plus, it is off in the desert. Yes, down here.
Yes, have you taken your history of earthquakes and run a parallel history of Pacific Coast documentation either volume or pressure? See if there might be a correlation.
No, that's been about the farthest from my mind. I'd be happy to work with you on it. I do know that the Nostradamus effect was at a maximum in 1929, and they were predicting a great earthquake for here. At least Orson Welles had been predicting one for here, not Nostradamus. He had said, if 5 astrological effects are coincident, the new city will be destroyed. And he said this one in 1530 or something. Well, Orson Welles said it about 1981, and he picked 1988, I believe, for the great day. Well, in 1988, only 3 of the 5 astronomical effects were there. You have to go up to the year 3700 to see a similar arrangement of all 5 between Uranus and Neptune and Mars or whatever in conjunction. So I was debunking the Nostradamus Orson Welles thing as strongly as I could. I was getting calls from Los Angeles, people afraid to leave their homes. I mean, this is panic city. So I work in the other way too. I'm not a fearmonger. You know, where appropriate, I try to settle things down based on the best knowledge I have. But I'm not afraid to tell you what I think. Yes?
Has Naples, Italy ever been hit by an earthquake?
Oh, yes. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned that. What is Naples? Neapolitan. New city. Exactly right. In 19... Well, good, okay. My boy loves Jeopardy, yeah. He seems to always run over to the neighbors to watch it just when there's chores to do, you know. But Neapolitan, right. The best seismic window of 1980 was November 22nd to 29th. On November 23rd, a 7 magnitude quake did a lot of damage in Naples, killed at least 1,000. Killed. They recognized at least 3,000. General Tamburino said in Avellino province alone, he believed 10,000 people had met their death. It was in the cold, it was November. And there was snow. They couldn't even get to some of these villages back there. And so the death numbers were piling up, 3,100, 3,105. And then they said nothing about deaths. And about a month later, they said we lost almost 3,000. So I think they effectively covered up the deaths there, too. It's just like a battle casualty ward.
That has been actually Nostradamus'
Sure.
prediction.
Or the one in 1531, or the one in, I think 1741. I know this date that I mentioned the last time before 1865, 124 years, 1741. I know that was a significant earthquake date. I can't pin it down to place yet, because I just thought about it a couple days ago and I haven't been back to the computer. But it might have been Shimaza, 1741 was definitely a very destructive earthquake, and it might have been Naples.
I just want to make one more
Okay.
unrelated point to that. In regards to the stock market, you mentioned about the weekend of October the 13th, 89. I don't know if you remember or not, because I don't know if you follow the stock market or not.
Some, but not
we
much.
had a mini crash that weekend, especially Friday was particularly bad.
We've had so many of those, you know. But you might just relate, you might try.
That was the worst since 87.
Was it? Okay.
That,
Yes, back here.
You have other data for the prediction of an LA quake soon.
Yes.
Is
Yes.
there a Caribbean spring tide involved with this one too?
Yes, in March 26th. It may not hold off now. Here's what really concerns me about the Los Angeles area. Normally, in a printout from Caltech, which I get monthly, there are about 20 quakes of 3.0 or better within 200 miles of Los Angeles. That goes up to Bishop and down to Baja, California. In October, when we had a big quake, down here there were only 7 quakes, only 5 quakes of 3.0 or more within that 200 miles, and the maximum was only a 3.3. That is just ridiculous. Now, in the past, when you've had very minimal numbers, less than 10, on 6 occasions, it's been followed with a 5.5 to 6.8 in this area. And last July, you had 7, which tied the record of September 1987. And you know what happened October 1st? Whittier. And you know what happened November 23rd and 24th? A 6.3 and a 6.8 down by the Salton Sea. That quake had been predicted by Dr. Knophoff, the geophysicist at the UCLA, and his co-author, Steve Kilston, an astronomer. And they had predicted there would be a 6 magnitude quake on the San Andreas system around November of 87, published in Nature in 1983, because that would be the next nodal point of the moon, when the moon was as high in the sky as it could get, and they noticed that past quakes in Southern California had fit that kind of astronomical pattern. They were poo-pooed and laughed at, and they got 2 of them in November of 87, and they haven't had a 6th since. They had a 6th since, I guess. So, yes?
I'd like to ask your interpretation of the heavy rainfall that created the earthquake.
Yes.
That is naturally due to the water penetrating the lower layers and providing a kind of a grease or a lubricant for the slippage.
That's part of it.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
Then the next thing is it also, you also talked about the delayed effect.
Yes.
Because of the rotation of the Earth.
Yes. Well, for Earth tides, yes.
Right. In other words, you get the forces, the gravitational forces from the moon.
Yes.
Then you have the velocity vector of the Earth, the rotational vector. But then is the Coriolis force.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in other
Things,
words, that causes the slippage, in my view.
Well, you could imagine that if the fault is moving in that direction, but if it's an up and down fault,
Oh, I see.
so it can vary from place to place. Interestingly, a doctor, what's his name, at Caltech, he was working on his doctorate. He published an article which got worldwide recognition that in Southern California, 32 large earthquakes fit the phase of the moon. And then he went to work for the Geological Survey. And he published another article saying he was all wrong before he apologized to his colleagues. He really didn't know his statistics. There's really nothing to it. I was pleased to see he was a signatory to an article which appeared in Geology last July, the most widely read journal in my field. And Heaton is his name. He was one of 4 reviewers from the U.S. Geological Survey reviewing an article by a member of the USGS in Reston, Virginia. The title is Strong Correlation Between Earth Tides and Earthquakes of Part of the Eastern United States. Well, I thought we had the same sun and moon in the West, so I don't see the problem. But the USGS people apparently were unaware of that article. And if they were aware of it, they didn't believe it. I don't know if you review an article whether you have to accept it, but at least you should be familiar with it. And it's very, very strange. On this table here, there's all kinds of background data on quakes that I've been predicting. And when that 86 quake hit in December 29th, right on schedule, a spokesperson for the U.S. Geological Survey said, well, maybe the tides did have something to do with the quake. In the next day's paper, he went 180 degrees and he said, no, I don't think the tides had anything to do with the quake, because it was on a very active fault line anyway. All I can think is that his superiors got to him and said, are you going to agree with Berkland, or are you going to continue to work with us? What else? And so a radio station picked up on that and said, what do you think about that comment? And I said, I think it's about like saying the 10-car pileup on the Bayshore Freeway had nothing to do with the sudden cloudburst because it's a very busy highway anyway. When you see a correlation, why turn your back on it? I showed them a list of earthquakes in Earthquake Prediction and Public Policy by the National Academy of Sciences. 5 representative earthquakes listed. The only table in that whole book. Came out in 1975. Of course, they talk about the magnitude and the intensity and the damage and the deaths and so forth. They could care less about what the moon was doing, but that was of primary interest to me, so I looked. There's 1933, Long Beach. It was the day of an eclipse of the moon. There's 1959, Hebgen Lake, Montana, day of the full moon. 1952 at Tehachapi, the day of the new moon. That was the 7.7. That was the last 7 magnitude quake before 1980 Eureka, and the next 7 was the World Series quake. Then there was 1964 Alaska, which was also on the day of the full moon. And finally, there was 1971, February 9th, see if I have that here. Those that were in Southern California will remember it. It was the day of the San Fernando earthquake and the day of a total eclipse of the moon. And I was looking back through some old LA Times to see if the Lost and Found were going to tell me anything about it. It turns out they were very explicit. It could hardly miss. But I was surprised to see an article about the astronomer at Griffith Park Observatory, Dr. Kaufman, Robert Kaufman. He said, I think yesterday's earthquake had something to do with yesterday's eclipse of the moon. Not that it created the quake, but through extra gravitational stress triggered a weak place in the fault. My idea. And they had it 3 years before I had it. But, you know, I didn't find out about it until after I had my idea, so I can still say it originally conceived by Jim Berkland, too. So, yes?
Have you made any correlations between...
Norman, sit down, Norman, you're asking all the questions.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't recognized anybody on this side, yeah. Way back, okay. Put my glasses on. Today, right now? Yeah, just had a new moon. But we had new moon apogee. Now that would trouble me if it weren't for the fact the astronauts settled that some years ago when they left seismographs on the moon. Turns out there are moonquakes. They've measured up to 4.8 magnitude. Most of them are 1s and 2s. But most of them occur on the once monthly time of perigee when the Earth and Moon are closest. But there's a secondary little flurry at the time of apogee. So it's not the pure bulk of the magnetic or the gravitational stress. It's also the rate of change. Transition points can be just as critical, apparently.
What about the potential sites, the possibilities of where it might be? And the other part of that is, are any of your detractors in geological surveys predicting anything in the time?
Well, we're all looking at what happened in 1857, and January 9th, the day of the full moon, the last time the locked portion of the San Andreas down here cut loose with about an 8.4. It was stronger than the San Francisco earthquake. And it was 50 years sooner. I mean, it's been longer going. The fault is pretty much a continuum. We know the Pacific plate is moving by about 2 inches a year. And so that's a foot every 6 years. You go 60 years, that's 10 feet. In 1857, the fault down here moved 30 feet. It took a round sheep corral and turned it into the letter S. 30 feet. So it would take about, I think, 180 years to get back to 30 feet, but it may be the fault is going to slip before then. And most everybody that's looked at it said this is really the next due place. In fact, that was really interesting. Dr. Urhammer at Berkeley said, Berkland makes me mad. It's easy to predict quakes the way he does. After all, the sun, moon, and earth line up once a month. Well, I wonder if he was correctly quoted, because most of us know they line up twice a month. But, and he said, besides, earthquakes are random events. And if I were concerned about earthquakes, I'd be more worried about Los Angeles area. Well, doesn't that suggest that they aren't random events? Because that was, he was looking at 1857. So there's two sides of the mouth. depending on what serves, the purpose. Oh, I kind of want you. Oh, okay, in the middle there.
Nostradamus, I believe, he predicted a period of increasing seismic activity into the spring 2000. And there are other people that have been saying that seismic activity is increasing generally in time frame. Any comments?
I bought a big book on Nostradamus because after seeing Orson Welles, I was convinced this guy really knew what he was talking about. Turns out that was largely a fraud. The Orson Welles docudrama was very loose with the facts. And in reading this compendium about the Nostradamus predictions, you can interpret them almost any way you wish. And so I put no weight at all in anything that comes out of Nostradamus. If we'd had the quake in '88 and I was wrong, then I would say, okay, what's to say next? I don't believe we have to understand everything involved in nature, but I think we have to use it. If something works, use it. Maybe understanding will come later. Okay.
Have you found any correlation between shifts in the geomagnetic field and earthquakes?
That's the primary thing that the animals detect in my book.
Well, I think you'll find it interesting. Do you get the bulletin for Boulder?
The boulder?
The Boulder, NOAA bulletin? You get those?
No. Oh, yeah, the monthly, when they're usually a year behind, yeah. Oh, yeah.
No, but it's the weekly.
Oh, no, the geomagnetic one. I get the earthquake listings,
Right.
and they come in 8 months later. So.
Geomagnetic ones. And then I know you don't believe in the looking at the planets, but I think you'll find that when the planets are at their stationary point, for instance, this weekend we have Jupiter turning direct. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't think it goes retrograde. The interior planets do go retrograde.
Well, Jupiter's turning direct, and you just have a big signal on your lost cats and dogs there. I think that you're going to see a spike on the geomagnetic indices.
Well, okay. Write it down. Let me check it. I've had literally dozens of such statements, and I've yet to see anything other than the sun and moon really work. In hindsight, it works pretty well. Yes.
Because we are here in the Cycles Foundation and we're predicting earthquake, you came up with the 70 cats, lost and lost cats that you...
57,
right?
uh-huh.
We had 2.5 inches of rainfall here in the LA Basin, I believe, over the last week, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then your prediction is you're close by, but maybe you're right.
Well, it takes a little more than, I think, a couple of inches. Of course, in local basins, it can make a difference. A foot of water over 1 square mile is about 1 million tons. And so if you have a big San Francisco Bay Area or the continental shelf, it definitely causes the crust to react. It depresses it, and then it responds. And that's just a 6-hour turnover time. So it could be like taking a wire between your fingers, hitting metal fatigue, friction belts, and pop. So, but it has to be ready to fail. And if it happened to have a little nick in the wire, it's preconditioned. Yes, over here.
You made some comments earlier about some of your predictions being attributed to luck.
Yes.
I thought I should mention here that there's a fundamental truth about luck that we tend to overlook. And it's very unclear. Luck always seems to favor the best players.
I've heard that one. Yes.
I'm good. Before we take any more questions, Jim might be willing to take some on his own.
Sure.
I think it's only fair to let everybody who needs to get to their lunch, and in keeping with everything, I trust that we'll let the dogs get lost and no one else will. They'll come back at 2 o'clock. So thank you very much.
Thank you.